Electro-justice has been a long Kenyan journey, inspiring, painful, frustrating, but we never stop moving forward towards that more perfect union with justice and liberty for all. Today, the struggle is more tense as the voting system seems to be infiltrated, and history is judging us harshly as we are on the receiving end of the consequences of the sins of our fathers. Our fathers exploited division, and from them, the nation is now reeling because of the vicious election cycles which have become so intimate and personal. This is how democracy is dying. There are no good people on both sides of the political fence. But the question that stands is, how did we get here? The majority of Africa was still in the hands of Africans when the colonial era began in 1870. However, as Britain and French imperial powers staked claims to African land, there were more clashes. The desire to dominate is a common feature of colonialism.
The alienation from their cultural, social roots. The bottom line was that the colonial system was totally oppressive.
Britain has brought much good to Kenya. Her standards of living are growing still higher.
Across Kenya, resistance was met by defeat and European occupation. The drive for independence could not be extinguished and soon gained momentum with the onset of the World Wars.
Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of
the general history of Africa says there has been a tendency to describe Africans who did not resist colonial rule as peace-loving and those who did fight as bloodthirsty. It says there was resistance to the Europeans in virtually every region of Africa they were present. The rebellion was just wars of liberation, which is why they were supported by overwhelming majority of Africans.
The British and the white settlers were together convinced that Kenyatta was the brains behind the movement. Everybody knew that he exercised an extraordinary moral influence over Kikuyu opinion. They increasingly felt that the degree of organized resistance amongst Kikuyu young men had to be organized from a center, and the only center they could imagine was that of Kenyatta and his moderate politicians. They couldn't get the evidence.
By the mid-20th century, the forces of nationalism and resistance were too great for the Europeans to overcome, and Africa began to gain its independence, starting with Libya in 1951, followed in rapid succession of Egypt in 1952 and Kenya in 1963. Then came independence. Those who fought the colonial powers in Kenya were regarded as heroes, but for the Europeans, they were seen as a force that had to be defeated. The pre-independence era was one when the country was glued together to the core. It was a momentous disguised occasion which saw every, if not all communities come together with a common goal to eliminate the white man. It was at such times when ethnic polarization did not take the center stage, since we all had a common enemy. Across the nation, the European invasion was met with massive defeat as Kenyans refused to be dominated, and this was the very era that unity was not compromised in any way. This was a defining moment for the nation. Kenya gaining independence meant a lot of things. It was envisaged that Kenyatta would deliver Kenyans from hell to heaven on earth, but all of a sudden, tribal politics started drawing lines where none existed in such a close-linked community. But by design, Kenya's politics was always meant to be tribal. Tribalism in Kenya is not a historical avoidance. It cannot be traced to ancient hatreds or warfare from cultures clashing over the ages. In fact, the major opposing groups, the Westerners, Luo, Luya, Kalenjin, and Kisii of Western Kenya, and the Gema, Kikuyu, Embu, and Moro people from the Mount Kenya region, had a little contact with one another before the coming of the colonialists, while the pastoralist Kenyan community were regarded as useless due to their minority numbers. Accordingly, Kenya's tribalism is a relatively new phenomenon. It is a product of modern times arising from colonialism, urbanization, and the political culture that sprung up in independent Kenya.
Now, the British built a railway line in Kenya, partly because they wanted to control the headwaters of the Nile. And they wanted to control the headwaters of the Nile because they were in Egypt. And Egypt represented the shortest route to India, which was a jewel in the imperial crown. The question then became how you make the railway line pay for itself. And in a nutshell, what then happened was everything in Kenya was focused on the railway line. And developments, roads, schools, infrastructure was all built within 160 miles of the railway line, about 240 kilometers of the railway line. That's where all developments were done. This led to a very significant geographical concentration of power. This is the power in Kenya is highly centralized. In fact, geographically speaking, it's highly centralized. So what happened historically was, if you look at the 8 provinces we used to have, each provincial headquarters was either on the railway line or within 22 kilometers of the railway line, and that was Embu. The only headquarters that was not on the railway line was Garissa, which was the forward base for Ethiopia, for Somalia, if you see what I mean. So that the state evolved as very concentrated. Now, what that also meant was, if you think about Kenya, identity tends to follow geography. So even ethnic groups tend to occupy particular territory. So what happened in Kenya was the ethnic groups that were within the 240 kilometers of the railway line also were inserted into the colonial economy very early on. So you had a geographically concentrated state, an ethnically concentrated state, and basically within that area I've just described, which is the area within the railway line, what you had were the Mount Kenya communities, the Central Highlands of the Rift, the communities in the Central Highlands of the Rift, Nandi, Kipsigis, the Kalenjin group, cluster, and then you had the Luyas and the Luos, and of course the Kisis. So the state was ethnically concentrated around those ethnic groups.
The politicization of ethnic identity began much earlier. It began actually with the colonial experience.
So what we want to get is power, that is the government. We want to rule our country.
Now what Kenyatta did was to continue the politicization of ethnic identity at independence instead of disrupting it, because he had the opportunity of disrupting the politicization of ethnic identity and creating a nationhood. But he lost that opportunity again because he believed, and other people believed around him, that the way you retain power is to manipulate ethnic identity, and that way you elite interests become protected by the ethnic group other than any other formation.
At independence, what we decided to do was to adopt Sessional Paper Number 10, African Socialism and its Application to Planning of 1966. And the government said that the government resources would be invested in the areas where they could earn the highest return. What did this mean? This meant exactly the same regions that the colonial government had invested in, which were the areas within 220 kilometers of the railway line.
The major beneficiaries of Sessional Paper Number 10 were the political elite. Now, notice I'm talking about the political elite of communities that lived close to the railway line.
Now that story so far explains why all national schools in Kenya were within that area. All major hospitals in Kenya were within that area. All roads were built as feeders to the railway line. That explains that. But where are the pastoralists in these stories? In this story that I've just put out, the pastoralists are very difficult to repress historically, and always have been, because they don't occupy territory, and they don't occupy territory for any length of time. Territory is essential to repression, and that's why farmers are so easy to repress. And then the populations are not stable because they keep shifting. So pastoralism challenges the state. So what the colonial government did was basically to ignore them and to put an institutional and legal barrier. The Outlying Districts Act, the Special District Administration Act, which basically said pastoralists couldn't come into the settled areas. So they were kept out. And that area was considered useless Kenya. The pastoralist areas were considered useless Kenya. So useful Kenya was within 240 kilometers of the railway line, and useless Kenya was everywhere outside of that region. And this is how the politics of Kenya evolved. So, because what then happened, politics was played in the railway zone. So, and how it worked was, you would get a block, an ethnic block. If you are Kikuyu, you mobilize Mount Kenya, and then one more group outside of Mount Kenya, and that was enough to get you then a block of votes, which would then allow you to fill in with a few pastoralist votes. Then that's how you deliver the electoral victory. If you are Luo, you did the same thing. You mobilize the Luos and another one or two groups, but not the Kikuyu for historical reasons, which we can talk about. So that ethnicity and the railway line and the way the zone was organized, it became the basis on which we organized our politics. And the pastoralists became a reservoir for filling in.
Kenya today is a country of a varied landscape, people and languages, but they're all united by a common history, the history of fighting foreign subjugation. This struggle for independence was gained through peaceful and structured mass dissent, protest, strikes, and political rallies. But in the face of discrimination, oppression, and bloody crackdowns by the European colonial powers, Africans had to resort to arms on occasion. These are the bonds that bound us, a crippling fact that we tend to forget as a nation.
This served as the breeding ground for negative tribal stereotypes, which then became embedded in popular belief. It is a blood sport that found its root in an ugly fallout of Kenya's founding fathers, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and Oginga Odinga.
Before that, and even moving into the elections and after the elections, the Jaramogi was definitely the undisputed deputy of Mzee Kenyatta, and they liked each other, and they worked very closely. And whatever they did, they shared. So Jaramogi had a lot of influence, like the appointment of cabinet, appointment of various persons. The target for KANU then was to try and discourage tribalism.
But as expected, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga resigned just 3 years after the country's independence. He had made the decision to resign as vice president. For the man who would later be known as the doyen of Kenya's opposition front, a cruel tussle in post-independence Kenya had approached a juncture of no comeback. Odinga, who was at the helm of the government until his resignation, contended that the government was in the palms of a master serving its national interests. Indeed, Jomo Kenyatta towered among Kenyans agitating for change, but also oozed the air by de facto leader, an emblem of resistance. He was as a result an unchallenged pick for all leaders, including Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who rejected an offer by the colonial master, which would have made him the first Prime Minister of a self-governing Kenya. Not swayed by the royalty of being the first among equals, a risk displaying Odinga instead demanded that for independence to be realized, Jomo Kenyatta had to be released.
Kenyatta is the father of the African nationalism, and the African national movement in this country.
But surely you're all rather more advanced than he is in your thinking about politics. Wouldn't he embarrass you if he was really let go now?
We cannot in any sense be more advanced than our teacher and master, whom I think is much more advanced in political outlook in this country than we are. We are still just in the stages of learning politics from him.
Kenyatta's presidency offered hope for economic and social harmony, but in that year it was clear that economic and ideological wars would become part of Kenya's great divide.
Kenyatta promised unity. Majority of the country seemed to believe that he could deliver.
Many viewed Kenyatta as authoritarian and a dictator because of the way he gave himself powers. His one-party dictatorship did not only undermine the spirit of freedom, but also sabotaged and substituted the best in humans with the worst in them, with the underlying question of tribe, a reality that we perfectly know exists, but hardly are we ready to talk about. His fallout with Odinga seeming to define Kenya's political landscape, Odinga striving for communism, while Kenyatta on the other hand stressing that Kenya at the time was a capitalist nation, the very point where the left completely rejected the right. Mzee Kenyatta and Odinga's feud did begin long before they realized.
And at that time, the relationship between him and Kenyatta was fantastic. They carried a fly whisk. They were both wearing the beaded cap.
However, the new fully autonomous Kenya would rapidly fall prey to the Cold War's virulent intellectual squabbles, and it is at this very point that the nation began to be divided.
This powerful nation, the Western countries were led by the Americans, and the Eastern countries by the Soviet Union and now China, sort of forced the world to be in two groups, so you had to be with one or the other. But Kenya had declared that we were non-alike, and those are the instructions for us as ambassadors. That's what we expect. But meanwhile, their ambassadors were busy in the host capitals. Like here, we had a very active American ambassador called William Atwood. They're very busy. They are busy working on our politicians, on our ministers, you know. So they created a local conflict. The Chinese were also very active. The Russians were very active. So instead of Kanu remaining solid, now the president found himself being supported by two groups that were equally strong. So Tom Mboya came to know, and even the parliament became divided.
By so doing, the Central Intelligence Agency's CIA disclosures revealed a background of selfish interest, mutual public hatred, and private reverence and honor, as well as the use of ethnocultural heritage to reaffirm the obstinate grip on power. And while much of what is incorporated in the papers was published in the Kenyan media at the time, they furnish a unique glimpse into how the U.S. administration perceived Kenyan politics and describe its stances on the nation's power troubles, including its personal tastes and aversions for specific politicians.
According to the findings, Kenyatta requested the British military forces to hang by as media speculations of a regime change spread. He even turned back a cargo vessel containing Soviet arms, just in case they were headed for Jaramogi's purported secretive force. The military also ransacked Jaramogi's office basement, removing a repository of weapons that had been stored there, despite Jaramogi's claim in his book Not Yet Uhuru that Kenyatta was aware of the cache.
The West at that time was not comfortable with Jaramogi Odinga. The only time they were comfortable with Jaramogi Oginga Odinga was when Kenyatta was in detention, when they had described Kenyatta as the leader of darkness and death. And they had this image of Kenyatta being a rebel and a communist, because they thought, having stayed in Moscow for a little while, that he was a fire-eating kind of revolutionary, and therefore anything should be done to stop him from becoming president. But we remember after that Nakuru meeting with the settlers, they were persuaded now that Kenyatta could become president or leader of an independent Kenya. And then now the fires and the spears were turned again.
The traditional rules of politics called for an abject apology, which there never was from Odinga's part, as he exploited division and turned the narrative into us versus them. And now he would be targeting a new enemy, tapping into conspiratorial fears that he called the deep state, who comprised members of Kenyatta's cabinet, like the likes of Ochieng Oneko and Burudi Nabwera.
According to the documents, he entered into secret agreements with communist nations without Kenyatta's knowledge, which would include having trained his own paramilitary force. One of the paperwork compiled by the CIA's Office of the Current Intelligence on July 31st of 1964. It assessed by the State Department details incidences wherein the CIA suspected Jaramogi of contriving a control steal against Kenyatta. The Americans openly despised Odinga, as evidenced by an intellect report captioned "Independent Kenya's Prospect under Jomo Kenyatta," published on December 6, 1963, just 6 days before Kenya was proclaimed a republic. It goes on to say that Jaramogi could have utilized the scholarship programs to train his own military recruits. In communist countries, some Kenyan students are gaining militarized training. Of 5 people she had unpicked, these apprentices were said to have been forthrightly expressed their desire to lead a rebellion in Kenya. According to the Americans, Jaramogi was pressing a relatively strong regional bloc so that Kenyatta could concentrate on regional integration while he consolidated his authority. However, upon the death of Jomo Kenyatta, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga acknowledged the differences between them and maintained that they were still family friends.
Are all your differences now forgotten in his death?
Oh, no, that we have not had very much difference. It's only the way of doing them, but the goal.
From this very moment, it became crystal clear that tribe would be a strategy that this nation would be using to put various leaders into the various positions of power, the presidency being the most sought-after seat. In night sitting, Kenyatta left a peaceful but an extremely polarized nation. He and Odinga shaped Kenya's political landscape on the grounds of tribalism.
Welcome to Capital Talk, the program we hope will have an impact on the future of Kenya. My guest today is a rebel with a cause. Twice CNN Photographer of the Year, Boniface Mwangi. Folks, this young man is, one word, fearless.
Always wanted to cover war. As a news photographer, I wanted to cover action, violence. My very first photo was a man who was coming home from work, and some people stopped him and asked him, "What tribe are you?" And when he said he's Luo, they cut him with machetes. They just messed him up. He showed his ID saying, "I am a Kenyan." And the police looked at him. They did not do anything because of his tribe. Because they go take pictures in the slums of Mathare, Kibera, then come back to the newsroom in the city center and guys are having coffee, like everything is normal. Every day I covered violence, every day I filed my pictures, every day they decided to publish my photos because they were too violent. And every day I got more pissed and more pissed and more pissed and more pissed. And the violence ended on February 28th, and about 7-8 months later I quit my job. I was like, I can't stand politicians, I can't stand the hypocrisy. I thought something was amiss.
By failing to mold a homogeneous state of 42 ethnic groups, Kenyatta allowed tribalism to foster and influence every sector of nationhood.
Tribe is a strategy we're using in this country, just the way we use poverty, just the way we use the element of male versus female, the gender discourse. Where if I see you trying to do something better than me, I find a blind spot, and the blind spot is tribe. And politicians have known how to use it.
The perpetuated feud between Odingas and Kenyatta more often than not translates into the trends of how Kenyans vote, with both sides of the political fence possessing masses.
Raila Odinga would inherit his father's political mantle, displacing the other pre-existing opposition supremos from the limelight. Uhuru Kenyatta, on the other hand, consolidating his father's political legacy by becoming Kenya's fourth president. But the fact still remains. Tribe is a major stimulus into how Kenyans cast their ballot, and the match that illuminates the blaze of polarization is almost deemed to come from an electoral cycle that isn't free, independent, or truthful, and putting out that blaze is close to impossible.
We've been I think the defining thing is elections. We started multi-party in 1992. Now the defining pillars and features of multi-party politics is elections. We've done everything else, I think, which you need to do to create a multi-party democracy. The one thing we can't seem to do right is elections. And elections is the most important element. Without free and fair elections, you cannot have a functioning multi-party democracy. If you look at the how many, is it 6 elections? Yeah. Of the 6 multi-party elections we have done, only one has been accepted generally by everybody as free and fair. That's 2003 election. If you look at that election, Moi was of course retiring. It's the first time an incumbent was not contesting, because he was retiring by virtue of the 2-term limit. It so happened also the way the politics played out, that the 2 contending candidates were from the same community, were both Kikuyus. So Kenyans were choosing between 2 Kikuyus, so it eliminated the ethnic polarization. Yeah. So it was a very peculiar, a very unique election.
Electro-justice has become just but a mere dream in Kenya. An actuality that has culminated into vicious cycles of violence after every 5 years, which are brutally broken up by police, with thugs taking advantage of the melee to steal and destroy property, and the police taking brutal targeted reprisals. This is the reality of Kenyan elections as we know it. But violence once unleashed knows no tribe. Therefore, The question that stands is, what exactly does the future hold for the state of the two political family dynasties?
The very fact that Jaramogi Oginga Odinga rejected an offer by the British colonial masters, which would have made him the first Prime Minister of a self-governing Kenya, but instead he'd wait for Kenyatta to be released in order for independence to be realized, so badly sowed the seeds of division, as it made one section feel indebted to the other.
Since Kenyatta's takeover, we've had two status of power, one which has been controlling the state and one which has been controlling the masses. This brings about a rather controversial topic of the system. It is the Kenyatta system that has produced all Kenyans for presidents. President Moi, Kibaki, and Uhuru Kenyatta have all been part of the Kenyatta system infrastructure, which is not only political, but also in the business space. And the possibility of that influence disappearing in Kenya is completely unimaginable. Therefore, the effect of this infrastructure would be felt for a very long time, something that even the voters have no control over. Majoritarian politics in the country has become a bone of contention. If Kenyan elective politics took more than just a majority, it considers that there are tribes who, because of their numbers, will never get a chance at leadership under the ethnically driven politics. And this is a hardened issue where rationality takes a backseat. By this, the bonds that united us as Kenyans are slowly breaking apart as we are constantly increasing our pace towards the wrong direction. And this is how democracy is dying, as there are no good people on both sides of the political fence.